Hello, Sacha. Lovely to see you again, and thank you very much for staying up a bit late. I know it's a different time where you are. We really have had some interesting stuff, and we've of course been watching a lot of the videos that you've been putting out, and it's really great to have the opportunity to chat to you. Uh, I know we both got quite a lot to say, and I know we agree on just about everything. But would you like to start off really by saying this time that we're in, why it's not a surprise to you, why this is part of a plan and you've seen it coming for a long time?
Yeah, hi Simon, lovely to be with you. And incidentally, it's perfect timing for me. It's late afternoon, the sun's about to set. Um, for me, for pundits like me and folks who've been kind of digging in the undergrowth for many years, this is not only something that's been expected for a very long time. It's actually a reward. It feels like it's a reward because so much of what we have been analyzing, diagnosing, and prognosticating for so many years on the fringe is now coming into sharp focus and into technicolor. And that is a dream come true because, not least because we're going through what Fulford calls a bloodless Armageddon, which I think should be regarded as a blessing in the first instance. People throughout history have gone through a great deal worse ends of cycles, ends of civilizations, are normally very bloody and very ugly and very painful. This one appears to be one that is taking place in the psycho-spiritual realm more than anything else. And that to me is entirely appropriate because it speaks to the fact that we have already laid aside the toolkit from Atlantis, so to speak, and we're really now engaging a higher resonance pathway of truth, disclosure, tribulation, and revelation. But to be a bit more precise about the question, the signs have been there for many, many years, for decades, many decades. And in the last few short years, certainly subsequent to 9/11, when the blanket war on terror was declared as a global protocol, and to those of us who had any kind of instinct for pure truth, we were able to see even at that time, and we're talking about, almost 2 decades ago, we were able to recognize that that was a clarion call of the beast, and that was really the trigger mechanism to try to apprehend the ascension cycle, the ascension spiral. And boy, did that almost work, because between 9/11 and 2012, that seminal passage, the bets were off. I mean, it could have really pretty much gone either way. In my view, since 2008, the timelines really locked into the ascensionist paradigm. That was my sense of it at the time, and I had that corroborated by a number of very significant, let's say, spiritual masters from different parts of the world and shamanic peoples. But subsequent to 2008, I believe we've been in a kind of massive clearance. And that really locked in and loaded for me when the Trump administration was swept into power almost from left field, against all the odds, against all expectation. And that was speaking not to the magic of Donald Trump or his white hats or his masters, but it was speaking more to the strength, the power, and the majesty of the common human pulse, which seemed to get behind that momentum. And that's what threw, in my view, threw the Sabbatean agenda on its back. And that cockroach has been dying loudly for the last 3.5 years. And it's now, I believe, going through its death rattle. And I think that what we're seeing is the very last death rattle of a dying Leviathan, which has finally been dragged into the vibral light.
I've nothing to disagree with that at all. My view has always been, though, excuse me, my view has always been that for the ordinary common man and woman, there must be something in their face. They don't mean it brutally or rudely, but for those of us who, and there are many, many of us who understand something about what's going on, but for the ordinary person on the street, they're not seeing it. Now, unless they're actually shown something, whether that's a traditional court case or something, they won't learn a lesson, Sacha. So do you think that at some point, some of this truth will actually make it out into the mainstream?
Well, I know it will. And, you know, again, if you're talking about, we've had probably 3/4 of a century, if not a century at least, of incrementally weaponized propaganda slash mainstream media slash engineered entertainment narratives, cultural programming, social engineering. That's all been the big collectivist, Fabianist, Tavistock sponsored agenda to liberalize humans into believing the myth of democracy, believing that we have a say, we have a vote, when actually the game was always rigged. And we know the Hegelian dialectic was written into the source code of the program. That's all changing. What does it take to break through the propagandized media dream spell or mainstream dream spell? That's been anyone's guess. But my experience in having spoken to so many thousands and thousands and thousands of people since I began my quest in 1999 and then formalized Humanitad at that time, and have really for just over 2 decades been at it 365 days a year. From my perspective, I've been in pure pursuit and inquiry of what I regard as pure truth and right action. And what I've seen constantly across the board, no matter if I'm dealing and living in the Islamic countries, in North Africa, in Asia, or in Europe, or in North America, the conversations I'm having at leadership level and with shamanic leaders and cultural leaders and kings and sultans and all the kinds of people that I'm fortunate enough to be able to access, I'm hearing a very similar dialogue coming through the common pulse of leadership and grassroots. It's always been this kind of technocratic layer that seems to act as the intercessionary between mainstream opinion, grassroots, and true leadership. And it's that technocratic layer that I've spoken about for at least 7 years publicly, because I also witnessed it over a decade ago in the United Nations when I by stealth was acting as a director general in the IGO sector there. I wanted to see for myself how the most powerful institution in the world was being orchestrated in respect of its kind of primary pulse. Why did millions of people get pulled into the myth of a United Nations after the Second World War and into creating a global compact that invited all nations to sign up to it so that all governments would end up being treated to that entity? And that entity was then able to, by stealth, begin the systemic collapse of civilization by essentially poisoning humanity. And I'm talking about poisoning through world trade and crossing all the lines there and blurring the boundaries, so that every nation state became, in its trade, reliant on other nation states for basic survival. Insane proposition to any economist. And the World Health Organization, the other horn of the devil in the UN, orchestrating the dereliction of human health, and not just human health, also through the agrochemical industries, the planetary health. So I've seen how this orchestration of havoc, pandemonium, has been systemically and incrementally engineered. But that aside, the conversations I've been having with living men and women of the soil, be they secretary generals or kings or prime ministers or ministers or good human beings, is a similar pulse. And that is a pulse that has been for a long time cognizant, subliminally aware of the fact that this invisible mastery, this shadow element, this shadow government that Trump rightly refers to as the swamp, because that's exactly what it is, that is something that everyone that I've spoken to has more or less acknowledged at leadership level and grassroots level. The problem has always been how to triangulate a creature that by its own distinction always remains invisible. Bring us now to 2020 and 2020 vision and all of that wonderful stuff, and the clarification that's happening through the lens at the collective level. We're being forced again by our collective unconscious, which is projecting images into the field that are coming back at us in perfect diametric proportion to the degree to which we have chosen to remain unconscious, generationally, civilizationally. And here we have a perfect conundrum. which is that we are each individually being met by the shadow that we have permissioned into play. So if we're an uneducated person, as you put it, then that uneducated person now has an enforced exile from a false reality into the cave, so to speak, by being forced to be at home, forced off the streets, forced into compliance by draconian overreach of government, municipal and federal. And those uneducated or unconscious people that you're kindly referring to are, in a sense, being forced into now addressing that aspect of their own belligerent unconsciousness. And the conscious people amongst us, Simon, which I heartily acknowledge myself to be thus, and you to be thus, and Becky to be thus, we are, I believe, seeing in what's happening a beautiful geometry of revelation and unfoldment that ultimately we will command and we will instruct, because we ultimately are responsible, and we know it to be so, for whatever manifests in the temporal realm.
I totally agree. I know that many of the audience who have avidly watched as many shows or as many podcasts or YouTube videos as possible to try to see what's really happening. And there are very, very few commentators out there who have their finger on the pulse. Maybe they have a little bit here and a little bit there. But I wanted to just get your take on what I'm hearing. Is that there's a concerted operation taking place now against certain elements in Hollywood. Are you aware of that?
I'm not only aware of it, I will tell you here, I've been speaking directly to major figures in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills, who are telling me what they're seeing out of their windows. That's all I'm going to say. There's no way I can compromise some of these folks until they choose to go public. But Simon, all I can tell you is yes, yes, and yes.
Great, because I'm hearing that I won't again follow your lead, but what I'm hearing is people are seeing Humvees or blacked out vehicles, excuse me, turning up outside, and a few moments to get the gates open, shall we say, and then individuals either going in or coming out. So I've been given that as a direct piece of information, and because of your contacts, it was very useful for me to, and I think the audience, to hear that you're confirming that is taking place. Now that's important, Sacha, because there are key elements in society that need to change. I'm not looking for people to be strung up. I'm not looking for people to be put against a wall and shot. But what I'm looking for is the control system of each organization to be fundamentally changed. And the media, Hollywood, and the concept of money are the three fundamental points. Now, how do you see things like the Federal Bank, the Bank of England? How do you see those organizations becoming part of a more of a democratic, I'm using that word loosely, a more of a democratic government than a standalone option? How can you see that changing?
Well, in the first instance, let me just say that the very last thing we want is them to be part of it. I know what you mean, and I'm not trying to be patronizing, but let's just dissect this a little bit. The last thing I personally want to see is anything revert back into a democratic format, because democracy by definition is cannibalism. and it's wrong. It's cultural and intellectual and social cannibalism. Yeah. So we really need to ourselves start to dispense with these false notions. What I do know from my own experience in understanding multilateral governance superstructures that exist, and then governance, federal and municipal government structures that exist, I think they're all fictions, and I think they're all full of shit, and I think they should all be entered into dissolution as quickly as possible. But that's not going to happen, and frankly, nor should it happen instantly. It is a process. And the fact of the matter is that we have conspired variously, unconsciously, and construed in our midst a paraphernalia of government structures and systems and protocols that, whether we like it or not, are in place and in situ. And they are an artery system that conduct our traffic, our trade, our commerce, our exchange, and all the different things that make up our field of reality. So to imagine that they're going to collapse instantly is to imagine catastrophic failure of our civilization at the psychological, emotional, and material level. dangerous stuff. No one wants to go there. So what we have to do is apprehend the fact that repurposing and retooling much of that infrastructure is the only salient and intelligent way to go forward. And that, incidentally, and I don't want to beat the Trump drum again. Everyone knows I'm a huge supporter of what I view as the Christed light operating through Putin and Trump. I've said this for years, and I'll continue to say it until I no longer deem that appropriate. But I'm seeing that Christed light that I believe is directing the chief icons on the world stage right now is all moving towards a very positive end, because they're doing exactly what I'm suggesting. They are repurposing and retooling much of the infrastructure. So to cut back to the Bank of England, for instance, the Bank of England is in a curious position right now because it has had to, in a sense, it's in a state of stasis with the Vatican element. The Vatican and Crown have lent now in together and have circled the wagons. In a sense, it's the last bastion of evil empire. The United States has already been retrieved with the moves that Trump has already made with respect to trafficking, with respect to the Telecommunications Security Acts that have recently come through, and with his declawing of the Federal Reserve and apportioning it only as a money printing exercise for the U.S. Treasury Department. Now, that's entirely appropriate. But people are saying, well, the Fed's still there. No, the Fed is there in the same way that you've just caught a wild tiger and defanged it, declawed it, and put it into a cage. It's relatively innocuous right now. But you can't end the entire superstructure of the Federal Reserve overnight if that thing is the source code of literally hundreds of millions of paper compacts and contracts that exist with every reserve bank around the world, and literally hundreds of millions of contracts and trade links. You have to collapse that dominoes in a very calculated and strategic way. I know that much. The problem I have in dealing with most people, and I make myself very available at the grassroots level because foundationally I'm a bohemian shock poet. That's who I am and what I am, and I don't make any pretensions to be running for any kind of office. And I'm not interested in engaging power or followers or anything. So I speak plainly to the facts. But I am part radical bohemian anarchist, and I'm also standing on the line in defense of certain elements of what you would call the fiction, the government, the superstructures, provided I am satisfied that that controlled demolition is happening on cue, as I am with the Vatican complex. As I've been saying since 2014, the Pope was apprehended at that time, Ratzinger put into cloisters only after he had sought clemency from the Italian president and then returned to a life of prayer. I don't think so. But he's effective, all but been under house arrest since that time. The Jesuit Pope was brought to the fore, and the Jesuit Pope, who I regard as a grisly character, has been involved in a controlled demolition of the Vatican complex for the last 7 years, since 2013. That's happened, absolutely. We've got the end of cycle of the Vatican leaning now into the Crown of England. The Bank of England and the Crown are still, remember, that these are still the acme. They are still the capstone, in a sense, of the pyramid of all land registrations and registrations of souls in every nation on earth. The Crown of England is containing Rex Regis, Rex the King, is still holding all of those compacts, papers, treasury bonds, birth registrations, death registrations, wedding certificates, land registrations, bicycle, vehicle registrations. Anything registered anywhere in the world is lent in as a collateral asset to the local reserve bank, national bank. That all folds back to the U.S. Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve as the banker, as the moneylender, and as the clearinghouse, and that falls back behind to the Bank of England, and therefrom it was falling to the Vatican. You can now look at it as though the U.S. corporation element, the U.S. Treasury slash Federal Reserve, has now been disempowered intelligently by the Trump administration, and on the other side of the equation, the Vatican element has also been disempowered. So they're both now leaning in towards the Crown of England, because it's the Crown which needs to release and relinquish its own false containment of all of those billions and billions and billions of registrations. That, in simple terms, is why it's a complex game and a holographic game for most people to understand. But you can be assured that the Crown of England, and that's why, incidentally, England, rather like the other Commonwealth countries, Canada and Australia, are so weaponized and so in collusion with the rollout of the New World Order, vaccination programs, microchipping, stay-at-home brutality. It's because they're all part of the protectorate of the Crown. But again, don't pay too much attention to that, because the Crown is circled and it's going down. It's going to invert. I think it might take between now and 2023 for all of that historical crime complex to be fully in dissolution and then annihilated. But I firmly believe that that's what's taking place.
Yeah, just for people who perhaps not quite along the road, it's a shock for them to have the concept that actually, even if they own, as they see it, a motor car, or even if they own a house, actually they don't. The Queen owns it, and that's something that, of course, has been very cleverly hidden from people. Right? Do you think that the Queen Elizabeth II has to abdicate before this can come to fruition?
It's such a difficult one, and I'm always loath to give voice to these kinds of predictions, because they come back like a catapult to people like me and you, as you well know.
Nostradamus said that there's only one more king after this queen, which will be Charles.
Yes, I believe that is the most likely scenario, is an abdication or a death, which will lead to Charles, who is the only one who is of true blood. I don't particularly want to discuss right now Harry and his brother William, but suffice to say, in my view and from what I know, Charles is the only true blood heir to this fiction throne, which itself is a usurpious throne. So I don't recognize the House of Windsor as being the crown. They are certainly a faux crown who crept in by stealth. But nonetheless, yes, I think you're pretty much on the button there. I think
right. So the reason that I don't think we want to get into personalities, but I think it's important because the monarchy in this country, in Britain, the Vatican, and certain other individuals or the organizations that they front up are the pinnacles of obstacles towards the ascension of humanity. And so that's why I bring up the crown. I think it's important. And you've talked about the World Health Organization, and there are many other organizations. These organizations are headed by people, but ultimately a handful of people. What's going to happen to those handful of people, Sacha?
Those who are standing behind seal of office, when the sword of Damocles falls, are personally liable, and they will be given fair notice. In fact, in many instances, that's already happened in the commercial sector on the world governance sector. I think you'll find that people have actually fled the seal of office in recent months, especially in the last 12 to 18 months, all around the world. Surprise, surprise, that is not reported in any of the mainstream press. But those who are hiding behind seals of office will that they are going to be personally liable once the badge is pulled away or once the seal of office is removed. And I think you'll find that there will be a mass immigration at that point from corridors of power. That's almost happening at the very beginning of the Trump second term.
Right, now we talk about the second term, of course. The election is the 3rd of November, 2020. And you are without doubt then seeing a re-election, are you?
I think if enough people are still cowed into submission by the fiction of their own projected reality, then I think things could turn out a little fuzzy. My sense right now is that Trump will not overturn into power for a second term, but that it will likely be the biggest landslide victory in American politics. That's my sense of it right now. If enough people continue to drink the proverbial Kool-Aid and boons and reflex into the petty tyrannical, which itself is taking instruction and clicking its heels authorities, which click there, like the United Nations World Health Organization, then we're in for a harder ride than we could have. But as soon as people of the world start to get passionate and in a sense angry about how undignified they're, how they've been forced into compliance with these bullshit statutes and regulations, which are insisting that we all stand 6 meters apart from one another. Again, it's a vaudeville, it's a pantomime, it's theater, it's insidious, it's ridiculous in equal measure. I know the truth of COVID-19. I know the truth of Corona as a spectrum of standard influenza to countless epidemiologists and virologists and researchers, investigators, health administrators in the recent judicial inquiry, which is actually still ongoing. My week is made up of communicating to world leaders, all of a mind, most bizarre, aberrant fantasy being projected into the field by a group of creatures that no one seemed to know.
Right. So I think we're fully agreed on that. The issue here, I think, for the planet is that it isn't just a small group of awake and aware people who march forward and leave everyone else behind them. That this battle is for as many people as possible. What do you think it is that will be the biggest wake-up moment for these people? I mean, there are still literally millions of people who are still choosing to live in the old paradigm. Now, what is going to happen, Sacha, in your opinion, to make these people suddenly realize that they have to leave the old fear behind?
I think the realization, which is almost certainly coming, when the extent of blood ritualism, human trafficking, child sex abuse, ritual sacrifice of innocence, and global pedophile rings. I think once that particular evil is fully surfaced, which is again almost certainly going to happen now in the coming months and couple of years, I think it's a slow story that has to be introduced with some precision. But I think once people recognize that their religious institutions have and government shadow institutions and military bases and intelligence apparatus like the CIA and MI5, 6, Mossad, all the rest of them, when people of the world realize incrementally that these institutions, venerable institutions, have in fact been the entire apparatus within which that evil has been orchestrated, I think that's when the scales fall from the eyes. But there are more pressing ways that people will wake up, which is when they realize that we've gone from being a false light, fiat, usurious economy into being a completely different kind of global ecology and economy. And that is almost certainly what's going to be coming through the end of this tunnel, whether it takes another 3 weeks, 3 months, or 3 years.
But to do that, certain things have to change within that network, which we call the media. Unless that is changed, then the ordinary people will never get the picture. I often make a joke, it's a serious joke, is that if you put a spaceship above every city and left it there for 10 days and then took the spaceship away, people would shake their heads and say, I must have imagined it. But if a guy with a suit and a tie comes on the television and makes a statement, people believe it. So the control of the media, or the release of the media, that's key. Do you see that happening anytime soon, Sacha?
Yes, I do. And I've also said this recently, that I believe, again, that as soon as Trump is in power for the second term, that is when he turns his gun sights on taking down. He's already begun that process, I believe. But I believe that the weaponized mainstream media is literally going through a death rattle right now, and I think it knows it as well. Right. I believe that next year will be the year of the takedown of mainstream media and takedown of the Zionist enterprise as well. We've already seen banksters being taken down, and we've seen human trafficking, pedophilia, and the opiate trade being taken down. Those were the biggies. Gun running and drug running, money laundering. All of those things have been addressed by the Trump administration with the executive orders that man has signed. And Putin has already flushed that stuff pretty much out of Russia altogether. Putin, as you probably know, is now just planting organic farms throughout Russia and has flushed out the IMF. There is no more debt. First time in history that a superpower has no debt to the IMF and the World Bank. And why aren't we saluting President Vladimir Putin?
Mhm. Do you think it's a plan that goes back many thousands of years? Because we're looking at Putin, we're looking at Trump, and we're looking at Boris Johnson in Britain. Three men who are mavericks, three men who are not actually controlled in the same way as we would always expect. What's brought these three people to the fore? Is it just chance, or do you think there's something much more at work?
Much more at work. And that much more is the most powerful aspect of the majesty of 3D temporal creation that we could imagine, which is the common human pulse. Again, that is the thing that is rising. The Christed light is the thing that is rising. That is flaming throughout the world. That is also connected to the conjugation with the photon band and the position we have in the galactic plane subsequent to 2012. At the macro and the micro level, that vibral light from the dielectric universe, the paramagnetic earth, the human strata, we are all fractal antenna. And we are picking up the hyperdimensional codes whether we're aware of them or not. And that reaches a threshold maximum, and I believe it's done that already. And I believe that now we're moving through the bifurcation stage, the shedding stage, the apocalypse, the falling away of the skin, the mask of the ego projected mind into the world. All of that's leaving us. And I think that what remains is going to be a perfect canvas upon which we are able to then paint in true color, which is going to issue from the living men and women of the living soil. It's going to be the human arisen as the perfect hybrid of the galactic planes. And that to me is the beauty of where we're moving so quickly. Our fractal antenna in our DNA, our blood is about to hyperactualize. And when it does, I mean, we will paint such different images into the field. We're just seeing the fallen light of Atlantis in its dissipation phase right now, which is why I keep suggesting to friends and foes alike, we must stop identifying with the trauma, with the images, with all of this hoo-ha. Because the more we identify with it and plug into it and give it some kind of psycho-emotional validation, we are the ones pumping prana, life force, into that hologram. And we then allow that thing to come back and harm us ever more. But once we recognize that the human orgasm was always the bliss peak, was always commandeered, and the utility of these Sabbateans, this invisible mastery is always used our human orgasm, our sex magic, our kundalini, our life force, that stuff that streams through us. They know that what humans imagine is what manifests, which is why mind-controlling humanity has been of absolute essential to the cause of driving nefarious agendas. But I would also say, as a caveat, that we are the ones at the soul level who permission the egregore to utilize us in that way. It's all part of a self-reflected biofeedback mechanism for our own soul evolution. And all we need to do at any given point is stand in recognition of that fact in our sovereign flame and re-anchor ourselves to the hyperdimensional field and to this earth plane, and then become the progenitor of whatever it is that we want to see.
5G is still a problem. I've been aware of a memo that's gone from a semi-military laboratory to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, warning him what 5G really is. How long before 5G is not acceptable on this earth? Months or years?
It's not going to be years, and it's already started to be disarmed in different parts. I think if you look into New Zealand, you may well find that New Zealand has already become disarmed at 5G. So again, I've been saying this since last year, since I released the 5G Apocalypse Extinction Event film, and I've been asked by countless journalists in the interim, why the Trump administration, for instance, still endorsing and sponsoring the rollout of 5G. And I've made it quite clear that he has no choice but to do that. Again, there are trillions of dollars and hundreds, thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of very serious contracts that are entangled in the rollout. You can't just dissipate that with waving a magic wand, not unless you enact your full commander-in-chief status and declare complete martial law. And if you do that, you invite a tidal wave of dissent that you've become a tyrant, a despot, a Hitler, a Nazi. And so Trump is constantly trying to exercise the commander-in-chief protocol and or the president for the people protocol and or the corporate chief, the CEO of the Corporation of America. It's a very complex office to sustain. He's not in the same position that someone like Vladimir Putin has been in, where he was able to enact and exact a different kind of ferocious leadership style and get away with it. Thank God he did, in my view. To answer your question on 5G, it is being de-weaponized in many instances, and it's also being apprehended for the evil that it represents in many other instances. Brussels is not the least of those. It's a very significant instance, the Brussels mayor. But I think you'll find that 5G becomes 6G, becomes 7G, becomes Tesla-based frequencies, and is disarmed relatively easily with high security protocols, which can step in at 2 minutes to midnight and do that. And if you study the Safe Telecommunications Act that was just released a few short weeks ago, last month, I think, by the White House, that sets the stage for America to then disarm it. And the fact that Boris Johnson is stepping away from Huawei in the same way that the United States stepped away from Huawei, I think they recognize now that China was being set up by the transnationalist Sabbateans as being the evil element that was going to franchise 5G, weaponize 5G to the world. And that was playing into a dialectic that was going to try and enmitize China and turn them into the enemy of the West to bring about another conflation. But Trump and Xi Jinping, Boris Johnson and Vladimir Putin are almost certainly communicating quite openly to one another. And I think you'll find that Xi Jinping himself is very aware of the fact that China has been utilized by that Sabbatean element, and he himself will be cleaning up house roundabout now. What I think you may find in the coming days and weeks is that we're going to increasingly allow for the demonization of China. Trump is going to allow it, Johnson will allow it, Putin will allow it, even Xi Jinping will allow it. And indeed, all the focus will go towards China as responsible for this Wuhan COVID outbreak and for bioweaponing. That's almost certainly going to happen. And I believe that they're allowing China to take the ball. China will take the ball. There will then be massive congressional, parliamentary, scientific, academic investigations, which will lead from Wuhan COVID outbreak all the way to the United States university complex and deep state complex. And again, Trump will catch the ball and allow that investigation to come to his own backyard. Again, these are transnationalists using China, using America, using England. And then what will happen, I believe, is Trump will then allow those open investigations to lead through the belly of the deep state in the United States, doing more of his work for him, and lead that back to Purbright Institute and Cambridge and other universities in the United Kingdom, which will lead them to kinetic.
Yes.
Kinetic. And that is where you need to go, to the steel curtain, to see who owns the golden share. Hello?
Hello, Sacha. It was so funny. You mentioned the word kinetic and then it just went.
Unsurprising. Well, these pesky data mining algorithms, very clever things they are.
Brilliant,
but I'll just make the point very simply, is that I believe we're going to see a demonization of China, which will be a controlled demonization at the multilateral level. Investigations will lead through China back to the Ancom, Iran, and Milan, Italy, where these canisters were almost certainly released. Yes. That bioweaponry will lead back to China, therefrom to the United States, and therefrom back to the United Kingdom, which will reveal the entity I mentioned before we got cut off. Mm-hmm. And that entity is held by the Queen, who holds the golden share, which means it's not available to any investigation. So that's a neat and tidy little game, again, contained by the Crown of England.
It was really interesting that it didn't make it into the news, but I don't know what you'd call the Chinese secret police or whoever, but they did actually forcibly enter into which is quite illegal, but they did it anyway, into a diplomatic mission I'm not saying it was the ambassador's residence, but they entered into a diplomatic mission somewhere in China and then found canisters hidden under the floor. And so there have been, these canisters had been placed in key locations. Not all of them were accessed and used, but some of them were. So that's the information that I've got. And the other interesting part is the vast majority of the CIA were absolutely disgusted at what's happened and what's gone on. And I'm going to make the point that, you know, some of these organizations that are vilified actually do contain very good men and women who are absolutely sickened to the core at a very small group of completely insane people.
Indeed, and thank you for making the point. That to me is really important. Now more than ever before, we really must resist this stupid, pedestrian, reductive reflex of demonizing all people in the intelligence services and in the military. And I have very little time for the police. I'm sorry, I have very little time for police. I won't even go there. But in terms of the intelligence infrastructure and the military infrastructure, right now there are Good Eagle scouts, both male and female, in both of those systems, and they need now support from living souls more than ever before. And if we don't offer that support, we are really biting our own nose off to spite our face, because these people are on the front line. And what's happening right now in Manhattan and elsewhere with the recovery of these children, I am having firsthand accounts fed back to me. I've got every reason to believe this is as real can be, and more horrendous than anyone could imagine as well. But again, those stories will come out in the fullness of day. But for now, we absolutely need to suspend our own pedestrian capacity to reflex and then contribute to the white noise of disinformation that's out there.
Yes, I went through quite a feeling myself, because I had been planning to go to the US, from sort of December of last year, and that unfortunately was put back, and is now put back to the fall, and I had been planned to be there, at the height of these operations. So I went through some very strange feelings, because I wanted to be involved, I wanted to be part there, and I can't be. And I've been sort of receiving these reports, which are too harrowing to give out to people who are not yet prepared for it, but I think must come out. And people perhaps are at a stage where they can be more capable of taking that information. But the great thing is, I think, Sacha, is a number of places which 5 years ago, let's just call them the cabal, we'd have thought untouchable, now are no longer untouchable. And this very strange bloodline organization is continually looking over its shoulder now, because people who they thought were true to them are breaking ranks. And so all over the country, and in Italy, I think that was the other place where there's been some serious operations. There have been some freeing of human beings, and yet the kickback from the evil side has been much less than I expected. Remember the locomotive that was sort of driven into a hospital ship?
Classic.
Think about all the things, yeah. But they don't have access to a dirty bomb now. That was my worry some years ago. They don't have the dirty bomb. And so I really do believe that this is a cleaning up, but we must take the majority of humanity with us mentally and psychologically. That's really important.
Couldn't agree more with you. And I would also add that even if they did have the dirty bomb, they don't have the capacity to arm that bomb.
Right.
That's already been completely disempowered. So, and that's been for some time now. And that is why we're no longer having this constant threat of some sort of nuclear Armageddon, because that's been taken off the table. And you have a very good idea of who the counterparts have been in the etheric realms who've been assisting humanity in that great endeavor. But thank God, because that was really the worst possible outcome scenario timeline, which had been was being engendered. And had we not moved into where we've settled now and locked into, that would have still been the gravest threat facing humankind. But thankfully it's not. Now, I've spoken to many, and I mean many, Illuminati, fringe Illuminati individuals, figures. 2 or 3 I've made interviews, films with, like Ronald Bernard, God bless that man, and Jay Parker, God bless that man. And I can say that in the private conversations I've had with figures who have come to me and asked for my input in the conundrums that they've been facing in the last 4 or 5 years, because that's essentially the time period in which I've met with a number of them. And they have been doing exactly what you suggest. They have been removing themselves from the contract of their families. They will not engage the Masonic secret society oaths. They will not engage the blood compacts. They are, and some of them even walking away from the legacy, which is huge amounts of money and affluence, huge amount. And again, God bless my brothers and sisters around the world who find themselves incarnated into that Rubicon, and they've navigated it beautifully.
This is a time, and I said this on Magenta Pixies. We did a chat with Magenta Pixie yesterday, and I said, and it's worth saying now, that this year, 2020, and you've already mentioned this, Sacha, in your own inimitable way, is the make or break. It's the most important. And all of us who are alive today are privileged to observe and be part of this. And I don't think there's an audience anymore. I think we've all got to be players on the stage. We've all got to make a decision as to who we are, what we are, and whether we're brave enough now to not just say, you know, oh, well, I'm only one person, what can I do? Those days are gone now. We have to make that choice in a non-violent way, perhaps, but we do have to say that the control system that was placed on us is no longer fit for purpose, and that we are now, as you've said, sovereign beings. And I think that this lockdown, which has been imposed on people for many reasons, is forcing people to actually look at who they are and what's important in their lives. So maybe it's not the football show anymore. Maybe it's life and death. Maybe it's the values. And I think that, in a strange way, was how it was always going to be. And that's why I think it's important that the internet stays up, so that we can do interviews, so that we can do these talks, because the creation of the internet and social media has allowed for ordinary, decent people to reach out. So are you planning to do any more roundtables with some of the other key people, Sacha?
In respect of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into weaponization of the biosphere that's underway, well, we launched it of June last year here in Indonesia, very successfully so, with tremendously affluent researchers, activists, frontliners in health sovereignty and geoengineering, vaccinations, truth and disclosure, coming here under the aegis, as you know, of many kings and sultans, which is very interesting, because we had hereditary leadership, in a sense, presiding over quite shocking revelations, which were new to that level of leadership. And I've been involved for 20 years in helping to thread those dialogues between leadership and hardcore activism, grassroots, and so on. So that began last year, and then has moved on to this year. We reopened about 3 weeks ago the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into Weaponization of the Biosphere, to focus on this corona pantomime, or the COVID pantomime. And that we've had 3 seatings so far, which have been syndicated fairly widely. And we're moving on for another 2 seatings. I think I'm right that the court is conducting another 2 seatings. Maybe the third one will be a summit event where we're bringing all these experts together into a day-long major
that's one that I'm looking forward to, because I think that's where it rolls it all together, and it should be quite a blockbuster.
Yeah, and that's going to be in May. I believe it's between the 7th and 14th of May.
Fantastic. Great. Right, Sacha, I'm conscious of the fact that the internet's a bit wobbly. What do you think is important that we haven't yet brought to the attention of our listeners?
That what we're facing more than anything else is not a war against them, whoever them may be. We are not facing a war against New World Order, Sabbateans, Satanists, Luciferians. This is a war, a battlefield, a battleground, if we want to use that terminology, if we want to look at it like that. But really, it is a struggle for us to remember our humanity.
So, Sacha, it's very difficult. So a whole wide range of people watch this. It's very difficult to say we are fighting against ourselves. It's very difficult to say we are fighting about what is a part of us and is created with us, because lots of people won't get that, and we'll confuse the message. But if we say that light and dark run together in tandem, and light and dark have to actually understand that they have a role to play, but I think that you're either service to self or service to others. And I think I'd ask everyone to look at the way they are, and their friends and their family and the politicians, and say, are they actually helping others, or are they helping themselves? And so I think that I'm hoping that the vast majority of people who have kept their head down, not wish to be involved, will actually find the courage that brought them to this planet, God knows how long ago, brought them here, to actually stand up and do what's right. And I know people like you and I, we don't want to be patted on the back. We don't want people to say to us, oh, you were right. All we want is for them to get their act together, get it sorted. And then, Sacha, I suggest we have a long vacation.
Well, I still say that this is about our own reclamation of our humanity. And that's the key thing. We need to remember that we're human, that we are not systems. We are not numbers. We're not digits. We're humans. And this, to me, is the great gift that will emerge out of this vaudeville.
So you're referring to AI. You're referring to some form of non-human.
All of it.
Control.
All of it. All of it. As you know, we could speak at great length about the artificialization of the human genome. God knows I've got right now Morgellons victims who are growing and sprouting all sorts of heinous objects out of their faces and their genitals and different parts of their body. And we're analyzing the most grotesque artificialization of the human gene expression. And I'm directly involved in that. In fact, I'm planning to do a special seating on that. But no, I'm talking about what lies behind all of that's why I call it vaudeville. Because we can have multiple conversations about the horrors facing humanity. But it's all about us reclaiming and remembering our humanity, our simple kindness, our simple decency, and the fact that we are the progenitors of all.
So how do we square that then with the concept of money?
By stepping away from it and by recognizing that war, disease, and poverty are the only thing that issues out of any kind of fiat or any kind of usury. And if we permission the next generation of economics to be predicated on any kind of inflationary principle, any kind of fractional lending, any kind of usurious principles, then we are permissioning the exact same Atlantean cycle of war, disease, and poverty, one way or to other.
One day we'll disagree, but we don't disagree today. Listen, Sacha Stone, it's been wonderful to reconnect with you. And when the lockdown is finally seen for what it is, we'll obviously get the chance to meet up somewhere. So thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to come and talk to me.
Thank you, Simon. Much love to you and Becky.
You take care. God bless. Bye-bye.